This is part 3 of Chapter 2, Economics, Policy, and Sustainability, as well as Ethics. So this in part 2, we ended showing you this image where areas, of course, that are based near forest regions or near rivers or lakes or oceans actually have more population, and the value of those areas are worth more in terms of ecosystem services that they provide to us, which would then make, of course, their ecological value higher. So next thing we're going to move into is this idea of valuing ecosystems, but in terms of a nation. So sometimes the wealth of our nation is determined, of course, by sometimes the ecological services that is provided to our country, but there are other things as well. So we measuring the wealth of nations, but the problem is externalization of cost is added into there. So, for example, even though an area of Africa may provide the most cobalt to us, the cost is externalized, meaning that their country is not worth more than the United States. And there is a problem with the way that we measure wealth of nations. And there has been a new initiative put into place where maybe we need to also, besides the next two things, which is gross domestic product, or with the genuine progress indicator, that we also should incorporate into their national happiness indicator, so NHI. Now, there have been a couple countries that have implemented this. The United States actually falls number 17th on this list, so we're pretty low, especially for a developed country, in terms of our happiness. So gross domestic product is one of the other ways that we use, and that is the value of goods or services, of course, produced divided by the population. So in there, it doesn't matter how happy your people are, or who has the most wealth, who doesn't. It's just, that's how it's calculated, the value of goods or services divided by the population. It doesn't matter if half of that population is living in squalor. That's how your gross domestic product is calculated. The genuine progress indicator, though, is an alternative way that we can measure this, okay? The GPI is actually the GDP plus or minus the economic value of enhancements or degradations to the environment. And most economists agree with the concept of GPI, but there is, of course, considerable disagreement in how do we go about measuring this. So how exactly do we go about measuring this? And so there's just questions about how do we add in the different factors here. So it's hard to determine. I do think that the happiness of the country matters. So how many people are living in squalor, how many people aren't, and how that can be incorporated somehow in there. But of course, then happiness has a different indicator to different people. And so there needs to be some sort of common theme with what happiness means, and we're able to calculate that into the cost. All right, so environmental policy. We're moving on from economics to policy now, and this is how we decide. These are the principles that guide goals, decisions, and activities. And we need policy. We need policy, or people will destroy the commons. So the government is another technical solution to the commons. And the government, even though it doesn't have a clear-cut morality part in there, good governance is supposed to be the part of that adds that moral piece to it. The problem is that if people don't participate in the governance, they don't vote, they don't know what's going on with environmental regulations, etc., then guess what? Then good governance doesn't happen. So the morality piece is not in that section. Although on paper, if everything works out right, governance is supposed to be the best way to solve the commons problems. And so environmental policies guide decisions, actions that influence the environment. And of course, they are achieved, these initiatives, etc., are achieved by, of course, regulation, incentives, which means you get a tax credit if you put in, a low flow toilet, or an energy saving air conditioner, etc. Partnerships, so we can partnership with government and companies could partnership together, and of course volunteerism. So these are the ways that we're able to get new policies into action. So this is how the policy cycle works. So it's a big step process. There's a lot involved. Policies can take years to create and then years to implement. So this is not something that happens overnight. The problem is that our policy structure is so daunting that by the time something needs to be really addressed, it can't be, because the structure just takes too long. So if we want to lower something, we need to go through this whole process, and it takes years to happen, and then by that time there's a new problem. So for example, climate change. There were initiatives under President Obama to put into effect reduce CO2 emissions. The problem is the fact that those CO2 emissions wouldn't be implemented until like 2026, which is like really far down the line. It's very hard to implement things fast. So it's a series of steps the government takes to develop and revise policy. The problem is of course is identified. Then the policies are formed. There's public hearings, debates, lobbying, takes forever. Then the policy is implemented, and then of course the policy is assessed. Don't forget in here that if you are not happy with the policy, you can sue the government, which is what happened with the climate change industry, and then they have to rehear all of the comments again. Huge process, takes forever. I used to work on implemented policies when I worked for New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, just in New Jersey, and it would take years. In fact, during that public comment period, we would have to respond to every single comment somebody would ask us about the policy. So it takes forever. Here's just a good little visual of how the policy works. The problem is defined. They set an agenda. They formulate the policy. A group of people formulate the policy. They implement it. It's assessed. Either the policy is revised or the policy is terminated. So lots of layers here. Here's just a bigger image of the steps and series that need to take place in terms of policy implementation. So this is how we're just going to talk. So there's the regulated mandates, which are what the companies must follow, or what we must follow. And these are the legal standards. And so there's all different types of them. There's the Clean Air Act, there's the Clean Water Act, there's the Hazardous Pollution Act. There's just tons of different acts out there that need to be followed by companies, by big and small companies, by homeowners. There's all sorts of rules, wetland implementation policies, etc. There are also incentives. We talked about this, where you could get a tax credit for something. If you buy a hybrid vehicle or an electric vehicle in New Jersey, you can get up to an $8,000 credit. So there's just lots of things that are involved with that. Then comes the government versus individual control. Oh, whoops, I skipped one here. There's the market-based policies, which are economic markets used to guide actions. These are like the cap and trade, which we talked about. Or there's volunteerism, which means work performed freely by community members. So Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute campaign. There's a lot of things that are grassroots. The environment actually has the most grassroots kind of pushes towards change. So they have a lot of different grassroots organizations that are, in little niches fighting for specific things. All right, these are important. There are 8 policy decision framework issues, and they're really important. So the government versus individual control. So what level of government control do we want? In the United States, we generally assume that governments should set and enforce standards for environmental hazards that, of course, affect the public and well-being. But decisions related to transportation, energy use, or waste disposal are usually left up to the individual. Should I recycle or shouldn't I recycle? So there's a lot of questions about that. I apologize there. I just clicked way too fast. The second policy framework is competing public values. Should we put our time and energy into saving watershed, or should we put our values into logging jobs? So what's important? So this is just really hard. Decisions about environmental policy often involve trade-offs with other public benefits, most notably economic growth. So for example, policies for management of the U.S. national forests are often influenced by, competing values for logging. So there's a lot of things there. Uncertainty in action, the precautionary principle. And so this is something that we need to talk about. In 2000, the European Union endorsed what became known as the precautionary principle. When there is a reasonable evidence for an action or policy that may place human health or the environment at risk, precautionary measures should be taken, even if the evidence is uncertain or inconclusive. This is actually what the European Union said in terms of climate change, was that, listen, there is uncertainty, but and maybe there's a little bit inconclusivity, but overall, the facts are sort of there for climate change, and we're going to move ahead with that. All right, so these are 3 of the policy decision of the 8. Another one is which level of government decides. Many levels of the government are involved in regulating actions related to the environment. In the United States, we have the federal, which is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Then we also have state levels, which is like the DEPs, which is the departments at the state level. Then we have county levels, and in some places we have town levels. So there's all these different levels in the government that would decide. So for example, a lot of times recycling falls to the city or the local town, okay? And they have to enforce that. The EPA is not going to come and give you a ticket if you don't recycle, but at the lower levels, that would fall to the state levels to do that. And which government agency has jurisdiction? So this is another good question, is who has jurisdiction to enforce these, or the responsibilities or functions of that exact thing. So for example, responsibility for controlling the flow of water in a river could fall to the Bureau of Reclamation in the Department of Interior, or the Army Corps of Engineers, or in the there's just so many different layers to this. So which government agency has jurisdiction? Another way, another of the 8 in that policy framework is protection against selfless action. So remember that tragedy of the commons. And this is really interesting. So if an individual interests prevail, the common resources are likely to be overexploited. So this is a form of overexploitation, is called the tragedy of the commons. And what we need to do is form policies that are formulated to avert these tragedies of the commons. So not giving too much leeway to companies or fining them if they do harm to the commons. Another one is the best means to the end. So in many policy debates, people agree on a desired outcome, but disagree about the appropriate strategies for achieving that. So should a regulation be enforced with financial or civil penalties? Should incentives the form of subsidizes or taxes? So how do we do this? How do we reach the goal? And political power relationships. So this is another really important one. They can arise because of geographical distribution of resources. For example, fossil fuels such as coal and oil are not distributed uniformly among states and countries. So for example, West Virginia may have different policies or implementations because they have the most coal, whereas other areas may not even have to deal with it because they don't have coal in those areas. Okay, so then there's also international laws, and these get a little hairy, but they also can make a huge difference. So the Montreal Protocol, when we're talking about in terms of ozone depletion, and we'll get to that in the air chapter, that is a big one that overall worked overall. Okay, so you can see here we have environmental policies in the United States, but then we have these international ones, and then we need to look at this, and where does it fall? So there's, the United Nations, there's the regional consortia, which is the European Union, the Organization of American States. Then there's international financial institutions that we need to talk about, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, which sometimes have a lot of faults of their own. And then there's non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. All of these people are working together, and so there are complex issues when we put environmental laws. Remember, because it's shared, it's common space. So this ends the chapter 2 of this session.